So I was thinking that, when I lived in Seattle, after I would come back from a trip, I'd always give a little summary of what happened. So I thought I would do that now for the present trip, and then get into the teachings. Okay, so I went from here to Boston, and arrived and went directly to Harvard Divinity School. Well, no, I talked with Janet Yalzo, who's a professor at Harvard Divinity School, and had medicine meal at her house, and that was really nice, because we're interested in the same things, about the Sangha and the development of Buddhism in the West. And then I went to the Harvard Divinity School, where Venerable Changshuan is. Changshuan. Where she is. And the Buddhist group had planned a talk. And so I can't remember what the topic of the talk was. Do you remember?
Compassion in chaotic times. Engaged Buddhism.
Oh, yeah, it was something about engaged Buddhism, right? So I gave the talk, and then at the end there was a Q&A session. So there's one young man, he looked Chinese to me, and he raised his hand, and he said, most of the Buddhist groups that I go to here are white people, and some of my black friends go, and, there aren't any people of color, and so what do you think about this? And I said, yeah, I think it's something, that we need to look at and take care of. And I said, some centers have special activities for people of color and people from other minority groups. And I said, here at the Abbey, we don't specifically do that because we automatically have quite a diverse community, and so many people from different countries and different languages, and people growing up under communism and the free world, and and so I said, we haven't done any of those special kinds of things, but it's good for the other places, that need to do them. It's good that they do that. And then he said, well, when I go to many centers, well, my black friends go, and they don't see anybody that looks like them. And when I go, I don't see anybody who looks like me either. And I said, I shouldn't have said this as the topic sentence, but the first sentence, but I said, why do you need somebody who looks like you? Because me, I'm pretty straightforward. And that was essentially, why do we need people who look like us? And then I kept talking about how we're all basically the same. And, if you look in people's hearts, we're all the same. And, and then I talked a lot about it, and he was not real happy with my answers. And then I talked about a little bit how I grew up as a minority, and then being a minority in the Tibetan community, and all that kind of stuff. Nothing, seemed to satisfy. And it came out later. Oh, and then one of the students, who was one of the organizers, asked me, how do we stop systemic racism? Yeah. Interesting question to ask a Buddhist nun. But afterwards, what I heard was, well, actually this came up during the Q&A, was you are denied, with regards to the man who asked the question, you are denying his, what was it? You're denying his racial identity. You're denying who he is. You're saying that he's just like everybody else, instead of realizing that, people from minority groups are have special concerns, and you need to pay attention to them and not deny them. And then I remembered, oh yeah, on college campuses, this whole thing of identity politics is like really strong, and everybody has an identity and nobody else understands your identity, and everybody's part of a minority that everybody else doesn't appreciate and makes fun of their culture. And I had forgotten, I've read a lot about it, that this is the thing, but I had forgotten. But what I really should have said is, well, I became a Buddhist in 1975, and since then I've been trying to train my mind so that I don't see differences between people. Yeah, and look, so much of our bodhicitta meditations is training the mind to not see differences, to not, it doesn't mean there are no differences, but to not think that people are their superficial differences of, their race, their religion, their ethnicity, their gender, their sexual orientation, their social class, their educational level, their nationality, and all these different ways in which we have of separating people into different categories. What we train our mind in is looking into everybody's heart and seeing how everybody wants happiness and nobody wants suffering. And in that way, we're all the same. So, the way we've been training our minds, and the popular way to see things at the university now are like this. Yeah. So it was quite interesting for me to kind of notice that. And next time I get asked that kind of question, I'll respond in a slightly different way. But Venerable Chen Shen said that she was wondering why the students were asking me how to stop structural racism or systemic racism, because she was saying, you're a nun, that isn't your field of expertise. And although I advocate for it, surely, I'm not, I haven't been trained in that area. So I said, you can either do it in the system or outside the system. So join the system and then try and make changes in it, or be on the outside and point out the disadvantages that need to be changed, but do it like that. That didn't seem particularly like, something she didn't know before. Yeah, but that seemed okay. So it was just very interesting for me to be there, and the sense of like we're all minorities who don't fit in, except everybody else is a majority who discriminates against us. And our training has been very different from that. But that's not denying people's feelings or the differences that do exist. It's just we're trying to say those things exist, but they're not how we want to, they're not the lens through which we want to see everybody. Yeah. So, and then the next day, we had soak, and then I gave a talk at Kurukula Center. And the day after that, I spent the whole morning visiting with old friends and new friends, and, and then with one appointment right after the other, and then went to the airport and took the overnight flight to Amsterdam, and arrived at 5-something in the morning and drove to, how do you say the name of that town? No, it's not. they have a special way of saying it, and it starts with an N. And it's about an hour and a half north of Amsterdam, okay? And yeah, and it's a very beautiful city, and I can't pronounce the name, even though I asked them how. And it was Jewel Hart's group. Yeah, they're only group that I know of in Europe. And it was a great group, really fantastic. And I know you had warned me that you had looked on a map, looked up their address, and it was down the street from one of the sleaze shops. I think you had the wrong address. This was a very nice neighborhood, with homes, and their place had used to be a factory, and they had remodeled it there were some apartments where some of the students lived, an apartment for Gelik Rinpoche, a meditation hall, a kitchen. It was really very, very nicely set up, and the people there were great. Most of them were 50s and 60s, just a few people who were young, but about 150 for the public talk, and I think 90 for the weekend. That's what they said they had signed up. So there was a lot of interest, and they were really nice. Yeah. And I was teaching Nagarjuna Chapter 4 about, working in the world in an ethical way and appointing your ministers and how to deal with the people who were imprisoned and so on and so forth. So that was a lot of fun. And from there, we flew to a town in Denmark it starts with a B, and there's an L and an E and an N in it. Billund, something like that. Okay, so maybe there's not an E, maybe it's a U. Anyway, so what somebody I knew from there, Martin, I can't remember his last name, who's a professor of psychology, neuropathology. I can't remember that either, but I mean, yeah. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. But I know what he's like. And, I pay attention to what people are like, more than this kind of stuff. So he picked us up, and he is a member of an intentional community that in Denmark that was started by a man in, I think, the 80s. And he was a spiritual man and, used to teach spiritual practices. And then he wound up going to India, and he met Organ Tulku, and learned Dzogchen meditation from him. And Organ Tulku told him he could teach it according to the Western mind. So he started doing that. And they have a whole community there. And it's interesting the way they did it, because there's only a small part that is owned by the organization itself. And everybody who joins the community, and they accept families and everything, you buy your own house in the village. So it solves a lot of the problems about rooms, and food, because you can go and live in your own house, you cook your own food. They have morning and evening meditations. And so I meditated with them the following morning, and then went to talk to with Martin and the man who leads the group, whose name is Yes. And he has a last name that I don't know. Yeah, but it was a very interesting conversation. We were talking about spiritual communities and how they function, and, dealing with students and stuff like that. And then Martin drove us to Aarhus, where we stayed in somebody's flat. And then at Aarhus, Ars, it sounds like Ors, yeah. then we stayed at somebody's flat, and then, I gave teachings at the center there, and not so many people came to the teachings, I think, because they didn't really publicize them, because the last time I was there, the whole room was totally jammed with all sorts of people who didn't normally come. But this time it was only some of the members, so they hadn't broadly publicized it, which was a pity. But the people who did come were very interested, and so were asked a lot of questions. We had a really good discussion. Yeah, and so that was quite nice. And then from there, we took the train to Copenhagen, to Pendeling, the center there, and and there was a interview there was a man who's the chief sports writer, apparently, in Denmark, who has decided to write a book about spiritual teachers. And he's interviewed over 50 spiritual teachers. So we were wondering whether I should really accept his request for an interview or not. But I did. And he was very nice, and he was really respectful. Yeah, nothing about can I throw a football or kick a soccer ball. But we had a really nice conversation, and so then I taught at Pendeling Friday night, and then all day Saturday, all day Sunday, and we stayed at an Airbnb, which was really nice. It was somebody's flat and quite big. And Venerable Jampa came there from Germany, and she stayed, the nun who runs the center, Venerable Chuki. No. Yeah, Tenzin Drolkar, Venerable Drolkar. She stayed with Venerable Drolkar, but then the two of them came over to where we were staying. And again, the people at Pendeling were very nice and really receptive. One woman who from Lithuania, who has been taking the SAFE course, came to take refuge and precepts. So we did that, and that was, she was quite excited about that. And then that Monday after that weekend was a day off, and then on Tuesday we flew to Hamburg, and Venerable Jampa came back with us on the plane, and so there we spent a few nights at the Tibet Center in Hamburg, which was very nice because I had heard so much. I knew a lot of the people from the center because I had been there before, and they had invited me to teach things before, like when His Holiness was there, but I had never actually been to the center itself. So it was nice. We had lunch with Geshe-la and some of the members of the center, and did soak, and I saw Venerable Jampa Sedrin and had a long Skype call with Alex Berzin, and it was very nice in the city itself, taking some walks, and then, but we were only in Hamburg, I think, like 2 nights, and then we went out to a German town that starts with an S that has a bunch of letters in it. There's no way can I pronounce it. Oh, thank you. Yes, so that's the place where the retreat center was. That was called Semkeling. Okay, and so I did a retreat there that was based on Chapter 3 of Precious Garland, which was the creation, the collection of merit and wisdom. And when Nagarjuna is telling the king how to create a lot of merit through the things that he does as a king, like setting up a good infrastructure and helping the people who are sick and building schools and taking care of the teachers so they don't have to go on strike and, all these kinds of things. So that was, I just loved precious garland as a text, So that was really nice. And then a lot of people took refuge at the end there too. So that was very good. And then we did Posada together, the nuns. How many were we? 1, 2. I think we were 4 bhikshunis, and then there was one shramaneri. Yeah. Oh, and also the day I arrived there in Ding. Yeah. So So when we arrived, then because the Jide nunnery had asked me to become their patron, and whatever that means, we're still figuring that out. But so we had a big meeting about, what is a nunnery or a monastery? How do you set it up? What things are important? How do you train people? All these kinds of things. So we had a long discussion about that. And, and Venerable Jampa also mentioned later when she went to, because she's been talking about the Abbey at different places where she goes. People are asking, they want to hear about what we're doing. So people are interested in our model and what we're, yeah. So that was Germany. And then we flew from Hamburg to Moscow and stayed, in this tiny flat with an elevator that you prayed to Tara a lot when you were in. But the flat was very nice. It was an old Soviet building, but the Andrei's grandfather or father had owned it and then left it to him and his wife Anastasia, and they remodeled it, And Venerable Tenzin and Dennis met us at the airport, which was really nice. And Venerable Tenzin says hello to everybody, and he wants to come again, this autumn, winter, and spend time with us. And Venerable Tempa may be able to come for the New Year's retreat. Yeah. So, so they picked us up, and it was really nice. And, and the food was, we walked into this tiny flat, and about a quarter of the room of the flat was filled with food, that's exaggerated, but they had to go shopping, and there was so much food. And so we took a walk in the park there. In all these places where we took walks in parks, and I really began to see that you can really get a feeling for a country by taking a walk in their parks, because you see the families there and how what people do to relax, and how the children behave, and how the family members relate to each other. And you also learn, that you stay out of the way of bicycles. Because you not only, in these countries, especially Holland and Denmark, you not only look both ways for cars, you have to look both ways for bicycles. So I had to really train my mind, because, I would just look for the car and forget there was another lane for a bicycle until someone went by. But, but then, so we walked in the park, which was very nice, a couple of times. And then the next day, we went to the Gulag Museum. Okay, which told the story, clearly, of the gulags in Russia under Stalin. And it was really a very well-done museum. They had many interviews with people who had been arrested and sentenced in time. The gulags were prisons of hard labor. You weren't just imprisoned. You had to go out and do hard labor. And they had interviews with people who had spent 8 years, 10 years, 25 years in a gulag. And many of these people had done nothing wrong. It's just that somebody in their town was mad at them and reported them to the police. And these people, very often, they were arrested and disappeared. You know, it wasn't like the police even came to their house with a warrant. Forget warrants. One of the women, she was a student, was walking home from school. They stopped her. They said, "You're under arrest." They took her away. Her family, she just vanished. Her family didn't know what happened to her. She didn't come home from school. Yeah? So many instances of that. People just taken from while they were going one place or another, or at their job, or, yeah. And then during 37 and 38, Stalin had a really big purge of the people within his own party. And so then everybody became so paranoid because all these people who were working with Stalin, he began to see as enemies. Yeah, as competition, as people he couldn't trust. And so he was arresting many of the officials and people in the Communist Party. And these people didn't go to the gulags. They went straight, you know, they had a trial which lasted maybe 15 minutes, and then they were executed. That was it. Yeah. I studied Russian history when I was at university, and so I had read a lot of stuff, especially Solzhenitsyn's books, which spoke a lot about the gulags. And the gulags, you know, some of them were in Siberia, but some of the largest ones were right around the Moscow area. And they had a map, you know, and really in the European part of Russia, there were actually more gulags than in the Asian part. Yeah, but Stalin, what he did is, because Russia has so many different kinds of people and languages and ethnicities, is he split up the different groups and moved them around the country, and then sent Russians to all the different areas, so that Russian became the major language in all these areas where people had their own language before, and then breaking up the different ethnic groups so they couldn't become too powerful on their own, and move them all around the country. And, you know, and people, it's very interesting. I mean, they were afraid of Stalin because I think they said that like 1 in 5 people were arrested during Stalin's reign. I mean, that's 20% of the population arrested or killed. And actually, I mean, I knew from before that under Stalin, 20 million people died in Russia. 20 million. Yeah. And so he was in power from the early 20s until 53. They had in the museum these, you know, films from the day that Stalin died. And so they had the interviews from some of the people who were in the gulags, who when they heard Stalin died, they thought, maybe there's a chance we'll get out of prison. But then the rest of the population, you know, they just showed these people just crying and sobbing and so upset because they had been taught that Stalin was their great leader. And Stalin had really industrialized the country. I mean, Russia under the Tsar was so backwards. Incredibly backwards, but Stalin industrialized the country. He modernized many things, especially the military. Yeah, and they love him because during World War II, yeah, Russia came very close to being occupied by Nazi Germany. Yeah, the Germans had started to invade. and they thought they would be able to get to Moscow before winter. The winter came early. It got them stuck, yeah, because they invaded like from a whole line from Moscow down to Volgograd, which was called Stalingrad there, which was in the south, just north of the Caspian Sea. And so the Germans were invading all through there, yeah. And really, it was very touch and go, for Russia. And if they had been occupied by Germany, like, forget it. And so so they don't call it World War II. They call it the Great Patriotic War. Yeah. And because, everybody had to go fight, whether you wanted to or not, even you didn't want to go, you had to go. Many people clearly were killed, but they wound up winning the war through the grace of the Russian winter. Yeah, but also Stalin, the way he had it, when Stalingrad was occupied by the Germans, and like the Germans and the Russians were fighting over the city, Stalin didn't give the people any space to, and Hitler didn't either. I think both sides told their troops, you fight until the very last person, you do not surrender, period. Yeah. And so, so many people were killed. And then finally, the Germans surrendered. I think that the city was under siege for a really long time, So the war for them is still very much alive and present. And I know this because when I was leaving Moscow at the airport, there were some people who just came and they were wearing some colorful kind of thing here, and they just came and went right ahead of us in the line. And Venerable Tenzin was there, and I said, are they very important, VIPs? Like, who are these people who are going right in front of the line? And he said, no, they're veterans, and many of them veterans from the Great Patriotic War. Yeah? So some of them were old, and yeah, but they really respect those people. On May 9th every year, I think that was the day that Germany surrendered and the war ended in Europe, then the Russians have a big military parade in the Red Square. I think this is where Trump got his idea. He wants a military parade. Yeah, every May 9th they celebrate, that they won the war. It's a real big thing in Russian culture.
VE Day.
Huh? VE.
VE Day.
Yeah.
In Europe.
Yeah. Yeah. And, yeah. So going to the museum, it was very good because they had, they made cells with the actual doors and so forth that had been in former gulags. Yeah, and they showed some of the utensils and the different things. They really did an excellent job, and it was very honest. And it really made me think that, that Russia's very brave for having a museum and exposing the ugly part of their own history in such an open, frank way without trying to whitewash it or cover it up or ignore it. And I was thinking that's what our country needs to do with slavery.
We have the lynching museum now.
Yes, I know. Yeah, because the lynching museum was in the paper right around the time when I was going to the Gulag Museum, and it really made me say, wow, our it really accentuated that how brave it was for the Russians to be able to talk about this and deal with it in an open way. And the Germans, too, with World War II, talking about it. In Germany, there's memorials all over the place. There's no memorials to the people, the Nazis who fought in the war. There's plaques where different events happen, where people were taken into custody or whatever. Yeah. So it really made me think, we have the lynching museum is like the first of its kind. And then we have this big discussion about the Confederate statues and people wanting to keep them. And this is part of the Southern culture. Yeah. And that how we don't want to deal with slavery, and keep up this whole, the Civil War in the South has been transformed into being, this romantic thing of the good old days in Dixie, and without any sensitivity for the people who are descendants of slaves. And so the contrast between what the Russians were able to do and what we're not doing was like really stark for me. The year before, when I was in Russia, because this was my third time going to teach this group. I had been to Russia 2 prior times. But the last year, we went to the Jewish Museum. And there, too, they really were very honest about how the Jews were treated, or should I say mistreated and persecuted in Russia. And I was really rather surprised again that they could be so honest about the persecution and prejudice and everything, and how our country just doesn't, it's really hard for people even now. I mean, the people now weren't even alive during the Civil War, but how their conceptual mind is so attached to the Civil War. And glorifying it, half the population, the other half of the population saying, hey, this was a horrible thing and we got to talk about why the war happened. Yeah, so it just made me think of all these things. Anyway, then from Moscow, we went out to the retreat center, which was the retreat center is one of Namkhai Norbu. He's a Bon teacher. His group owns the retreat center, but they let all sorts of other groups use it. And so just as we were coming, there was another retreat that was ending, and it was taught by a Khargyu Lama, and in the same tradition as Kenmo Droma. Yeah. And so we had lunch together, and it was very, very nice, because it was him, there was a monk who was translating for him who was from Latvia. Yeah? So that was very nice. And the Lama was quite nice, and because he and I agreed on a lot of things. So, I mean, people who agree with my ideas, and, that they're good people. So, yeah. So because we were talking about Buddhism in the West and all, and he comes from a tradition where people do 3-year retreats, but he doesn't think it's a good thing for Westerners to do that, at least not at the beginning of the practice. And so he's coming to North America. So I said, because we were joking about how, you have each place you go, you have the boss, and you have to follow the boss. So the boss is the person who organized it, plus your attendant. Yeah. So he was coming to North America. So I was saying, well, ask your bosses, and if there's time, please come out and visit us. Yeah, because he's going to be in Vancouver, BC, and then Seattle. And so I said, we're only a short drive of 6.5 hours, Yeah. And so then we had the retreat there. And again, just lovely. I taught the prayer from that Lama Tsongkhapa wrote to be born in Sukhavati. Yeah, so that teaching should go on the web. It has the Russian translation, so it can go in the Russian section, but also the English section, because I hadn't taught that before. And it goes with, make a whole Amitabha section. So as I was teaching that, and then Venerable Tenzin was leading the serpentine walking. Yeah. So he did a very good job with that. And, and Venerable Tempa is an excellent translator, so it's just very easy. Oh, I forgot to mention, I gave a public talk let's back up. I gave a public talk in Moscow. And they told me later that, do you remember the Pussy Riot? There was a band that had been speaking out about social issues, and they got arrested. One of the women from the Pussy Riot band was at the teaching. Yeah, in Moscow. And then at the retreat, there was a woman, and she and her brother are musicians, and her brother plays with in a band with some of the people from the Pussy Riot. So Dharma is expanding, and so many young people are interested in there. The public talk had at least 130, maybe 140 people. The retreat had 60 people. The retreat went Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday. Yeah. And just very nice. The people are great. And at the end, they wanted to do some long life puja for an hour or something, and I said, no, teachings are more important. And they said, please, can we do something? So we bargained, and we said, 20 minutes or something. So they did this, they had a text, I think it was, one of the Kensei Rinpoches had written it, a brief text, and they did it with all the things that you offer. They had it all organized and did the puja in Russian, and it was very, very sweet. And then that's where they offered the Russian dolls. Yeah, so just for the people online, how the Russian dolls, you have one, and then inside there's a smaller one, and inside that there's a smaller one. And so they had made them. On the outside was the big doll was Amitabha. Yeah, here. Thank you. Okay, so actually when they gave them to me, the small one was in this one and this one was in here. So you just get one doll, and then, so this is Amitabha, and you open this up, and then inside was this one, Green Tara. And then you open that up, and then inside that was Forum Chenrezig. So one of the women in the group had painted these herself. Yeah. She did such a nice job. Yeah.
Trushka nesting dolls.
Trushka nesting. Yeah. But, they're really beautiful. So, so that was good. And then we went, we drove back to Moscow and stayed near the airport. And then the next morning, Karen flew back to Belgium, and I flew to Amsterdam, and was met at the airport by a monk that I had heard about, and also by a very old Dharma friend of mine. And then we stayed at the house of a Dharma friend of Venerable Samten, which was very good. And I walked by the canals, and then the next morning went out, because my friend lives on a houseboat. in the river. And so we went out to see the houseboat and walk, and then went to the airport, got on the plane.
You gave a talk there too.
Oh yeah, I forgot. I gave it. yeah, all these places. It wasn't just a holiday. I gave a talk there, and the audience was very nice. The talk was on approaching the Buddhist path, and so I read from the chapter where His Holiness talked about his own his daily schedule and his own experience, and I only read 3 pages in it, but it was the basis for the whole talk. But the audience was really receptive, and so that was good too. Yeah, and then came back here.
I'd like to take a picture of you with them.
With the dolls?
With the ducks. I thought you loved
Oh, yeah. Oh, by the way, the duck up there is from Hamburg. Oh, yes. Yeah. So we have a German duck, a ducky, together with...
Russian dolls.
Yeah. Yes. Now the Germans and the Russians. Maybe we should do it like this. Yeah. I'll face in front, okay. Okay, so before we do the teaching, any questions, or what do the group in Denmark practice? They do a lot of pre-Dharma work in terms of, working with emotions, learning communication, developing good ethical conduct, and stuff like that. And so they have a lot of classes like that, which seems like a lot of young people come to, which is really good because it's just working with common life issues that people need help with. And then the teacher teaches them Dzogchen, but in a way that he feels corresponds more with the culture. Yeah, so I wasn't able to ask him a lot of questions about that and the techniques he uses and things like that. There just wasn't time for that. But they asked me next time I come to give a talk there. So, but the teacher was very nice. He was humble. He wasn't at all arrogant.
It's hard to generalize, so this may not be possible. But I'm curious, just the feeling about the Dharma in the West, how it feels in Europe. If there's the similar sense to how it feels here and how it's growing in Europe.
Yeah. Well, I think you have to really live in a place and get to know all the different groups to be able to say that. It's growing in Europe, surely. There's also some controversial teachers there, and some groups that are controversial. But then there's a lot of groups, or at least the ones I went to, where people are doing good, serious practice. But, unless you really live there, you don't meet the people, you don't hear the stories, so I can't really make an uneducated generalization.
In Russia, does it seem quite open and free in terms of groups coming together, like the Buddhist group, and that there's no problem with that?
Yeah, the Buddhist group didn't seem to have any problem coming together. And, they could sponsor a talk and a public talk, and that part seemed okay. But, just in talking with the people, because we also went into, after the Gulag Museum, walking back, we stopped at an Orthodox church, which was very nice, too, to just be in a sacred space. Of course, the people that I talk to are unique, and but what really struck me was the Tara prayer I wrote last year and that they asked me to write, and then the Kuan Yin prayer they asked me to write this year, is, it's dealing with issues that, the pain people are experiencing. And I wrote it with them in mind, but it applies equally to our country, if you read the prayers, Yeah, so, yeah. I mean, we joked about some of the things, but I didn't bring up a lot of political things. I talked about Trump, but I felt like it's not my business talking about what goes on there. Yeah. So I talked about Donnie. Yeah. Yeah. But it's interesting, and Karen noticed this too. Each place you go, each center, each country, the people are different. The feelings of the group are different. So, what I really noticed in Russia is when you give a talk, the audience is pretty expressionless. Yeah, and you don't, because often when you're a speaker, you look and see how people are receiving what you say, and then you can track, do they understand, do they follow, should I go more on this point or not? But they're really deadpan. And, but then in the retreat, where we were together longer, and then where they know me, because it's many of the people knew me. They said about half the group was new and half the group was returners. Then they were much more responsive. Yeah, but in the public talk, but you can see why. If Stalin's been dead for a long time, but when you have that kind of government, and even going forward, then you learn to mask what you're thinking and feeling out of self-protection. But it's certainly not like Stalin days there. Yeah.